with oil in the industrial era. The ownership of oil, the statement of that being sort of a basis for geographic boundaries and lines on the map, I would say that is a very small part of the story as to why things are the way they are.
Now, I'd agree with you here. I agree that it is a very small part of the story of how things are the way they are. The fact of the matter is that there are so many historical contingencies tied to that question that it would be naive to suggest that that's a sufficient explanation. Yes. The only thing that I was trying to get at was that it strikes me to be necessary, right? Like, I don't, obviously a sketching out of, any totalizing sketching out of how power functions in the United States and how that historically developed within the scope of a YouTube video would be a fucking ridiculous project, right? But I think that any such sketching out would have to come to grips with the question of the geography of oil.
Yes, the ability to control resources is key in terms of being able to exert power. But in that control, it requires the ability to exploit those resources, and not exploit in a negative sense, but to utilize those resources.
Absolutely. Right. Now, I think that we can look at the geopolitics from perhaps after World War I as being very much tied to this sort of geopolitical chess match over oil resources, extending very far out. I mean, if you look at the internal record surrounding President Wilson, they're very explicit about how we need oil, right? we need to be able to gain control over oil resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I don't mean to suggest that this is the only narrative that you can place on the past 100 years or so of American history, but I think it's a lens through which we can come to grips with understanding the issue of distribution of resources. Through that lens, the question of the interventions that you mentioned immediately after this clip, interventions in the Arab world, through that lens, those interventions become a form of economic satellization.
We can see these manipulations of information, or the ability to exploit information, has always really been part of the projection of power in all ages.
It's absolutely true. You go to Sun Tzu right after this. I would go to David Hume, who makes a similar point, right? Given that force is always on the side of the masses, how is it that the few govern the many, right? And his answer is through manipulation of information, right? Or manipulation of opinion is how he casts it. But I think at this point we can conceive of that as manipulation of information. Now, as a result, information technology becomes of amazing political importance, right? It becomes this incredibly destabilizing phenomenon, right? And I think you point out that a little bit later on, and I'm going to touch on that when we get to that clip.
And this is why I find so many problems with not necessarily the fact that this information came out, but how it came out. Because in having the information come out in particular manners, we don't necessarily reduce the power of the government, We don't necessarily democratize power. We merely move the ability to exert power from one group or one individual to a different group or a different individual.
Now, yeah, kind of, right? I'm not sure that I agree that we can properly conceive of this as being one group of authority or one form of authority being or authority being shifted from one group to another. Not sure that we can conceive of it that way. And the reason why is that, and the details of this would be far beyond the capacity of my ability to explicate in this video. But I think you would just agree that there's a link between the ability to consolidate and maintain secrecy and the ability to consolidate political power, any form of political power. So when we move into a world wherein which secrecy as such becomes challenged or becomes more difficult to maintain, then I think that has consequences for the capacity to consolidate and leverage political power in the old sense, right? In the sense that we typically talk about politics. When I say the old sense, it's really still the sense that we're in, right? But I see that link as something that is systematically eroding, right? And I think you'd agree with that. And then at that point, maybe it's too far, but I think we can risk the hypothesis that like political power is something that has to change how it works, how it establishes itself, how it propagates itself, how it blah 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 blah. All that has to shift. So the question of moving something from one authority to another becomes something that I'm perhaps a bit skeptical about. I don't mean to attach a value judgment and say this is a better situation or something. Yay, hooray, democracy, right? Something like that, which is, I think, perhaps the ideological move that the people that you're arguing against are making. But what I can say is that I think the idea of going from one centralized authority shifting from one centralized institution, I guess, to another is something that strikes me as being difficult to sustain. Put it that way.
Another discussion is this individual the correct person to do that? Or should this information be exploited in such a manner? And these are really the heart of the issue to me. It's a matter of, is this the right way to do this?
Right. So, I apologize first of all for cutting you up the way I have. I totally just cut out a piece of evidence that you gave. To my subscribers, link below. Please watch Skep's video before you take my points as being worth anything. I agree that the Assange clip that you played is cynical, right? But what I want to say is that, and I think you, in a clip that is a bit down the line, I think that you agree with me that we find ourselves caught between two paradigms of the relationship of information to political power, particularly with the spread of information technology and blah 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 blah. Now, what I want to call into question though is that like there's in how you're evaluating the rightness and wrongness of is this the right way for the information to be let out, right? How you're evaluating the rightness and wrongness of that seems to me to be caught up within a series of value judgments that are tied to um, a an ability to maintain secrecy that I think is becoming not viable in the world that we're stepping into, right? So, what does it mean to say that this was being done the wrong way in a world wherein which information technology makes the political viability of secret keeping something very unstable and something very difficult to manage, right? What does that, how do you make that value judgment in that world, right? Again, I think that we're caught between two sort of realities, but there's a question of realpolitik here, right? Where if the real material situation is that political secret keeping is something that's being destabilized and challenged by the advance of information technology, then that's the real situation. And to say, well, it ought not be that way or something like that strikes me as being sort of an anti-political abstraction, right? It seems to me to be something that is, if wishes were fishes, we'd all cast nets, right? It seems to me to say, I wish these modes of keeping secrets were still viable, or something like that, right? That might be a bit hyperbolic qua what you're saying, but I think you probably get the point that I'm trying to get at.
Because if we do things the wrong way, when we deal with a resource like information, when we waste such a resource, or allow someone to get their hands on it and to exploit it in a way that's detrimental to the whole but beneficial to themselves, that centralization of power.
Quick point here, and I just ask you for you to clarify this, but the way that I hear this statement suggests that you are equating an individual's political power like Julian Assange with a nation state's political power, right? It seems to me that to be of such vastly different orders of magnitude that to say that there is an equivalence between power being consolidated in a nation state and power being, public opinion being on the side of Julian Assange or something, like, it seems to me that to suggest an equivalence between those two things is, might be further than you really want to make. So I'll be charitable here and just ask you to unpack what you mean by that.
An examination of this. Let's look at the U.S. government and the centralization of intelligence under the Department of Homeland Security. I have huge disagreement with this practice. I believe agencies should share information, but I don't necessarily think they should be part of the same structural hierarchy.
Okay, I sort of agree with you in theory, but in some way isn't this ideological in the sense that is such a relationship as the one that you're describing as being preferable? Is such a relationship, viable in the long run? Like, that is to say, we witness the consolidation of power in the way that you're objecting to, and the way that I think you're roughly right to object to. We've witnessed this consolidation of power. How, given that historical fact, how tenable do you really think it is to say that these kinds of organizations can be kept secret, or can be kept separate, pardon me, not secret? It seems like something like I'd like for this to be the case, but at the same time it might not, given the way that power functions within the United States. Do you think that that being the case is actually possible for a long period of time? So again, we're back to the issue of what I think is a potentially, and you might be able to blow me out of the water on this point. Please feel free to to pwn me, right? But I think that there's something potentially too abstract about this, or too tied to um, an an abstract political theory as opposed to the historical reality of how power has manifested itself. Might be a minor critique, but yeah.
I guess the heart of my political inclinations, my love of federalism, in a way. The that's that's what we've walked away from as a nation in the United States over the past more than 100 years. Is that distinct boundary between Group A and Group B. They can share responsibilities and they can share information and share resources and the ability to exploit them. But if they share the same authority structure, then at that point in time, they're no longer separate organizations.
Now, I would agree. I think that I would agree that the situation that you're sketching out is preferable to the one that we have. But at the same time, when you say we've walked away from this in the past 100 years, that statement makes it seem like that act of walking away was just some arbitrary choice, just some bad arbitrary choice that we made. I think that that's problematic. I think that it is the case that our economic reality, right? I think that that shifting that you're describing is very much tied to issues like financialization of capital and blah blah blah, blah, right? It's very much tied to other factors in the world, also given a very different geopolitical constellation. If you have America being the number one sort of most dominant country in the world, that seems to me to place pressures on the internal workings of the government, which I don't want to say necessarily is always a stupid claim to make when talking about history, but it makes sense to me that given that kind of geopolitical pressure, you would see power within the United States consolidating itself. So while, yes, I agree that we have shifted that ethos, the question is that how tenable is the implementation of that ethos given the current economic and geopolitical constellation that we find ourselves in? And I think that's a hard question. And I think you'd probably agree that that's a hard question, right? Because it might be the case that given the current material reality that we find ourselves in, we can't actually have a good, government, Department of Homeland Security, or whatever particular issue you want to put on. Maybe, maybe not. Please feel free to prove me wrong. I'd love to hear my suspicions discounted, because it would give me a reason to smile.
If your state government is entirely fealty, is entirely, servile to your federal government, well, then you don't have federalism. You have single centralized government from top to bottom, because the order comes down from the top and the entire structure is built to enforce the will of this single actor or set of actors.
Sure. And you see this point made a good amount, particularly in conservative quarters. For me, though, I think that there's a problem in that this analysis conceives of state power as something that's sort of operating in a vacuum, right? I don't think that it's proper to consider power within the United States as being localized within the federal government. I mean, I think really the source of power in the United States at this point is best understood as being a function of the economic sector, rather than being a matter of uh, federal or state power, right? It seems to me that federal power is perhaps all too often determined by multinational corporations and such. Right? Perhaps that sounds like a trite critique, but nonetheless, I think it's something to take into account. It's not an either or between federal power or state power, and I don't think we have either. Right.
And that's how the erosion of democracy occurs, is through the centralization of authority, not necessarily the control and the secrecy of information.
So this to me, and explain to me, please explain to me why I'm wrong. Right. I'm totally open at any point to be blown out of the water, because I think that you probably have a better handle on the subject than I do, and I'll freely admit that. But it feels to me like in the beginning of this video, you seem to be conceding that the management of information is central to the functionings of governance as such. And then this statement, you know, the centralization of power is how democracy erodes, rather than um, secrecy or something. Well, it seems to me that you can't centralize power without secrecy, right? Like, it seems like you're splitting apart two things that you admitted before were linked in a more intimate way, right? Um, Strikes me as being, maybe it's not a proper contradiction, but it strikes me as being a source of tension for the things that you're saying in the video. That's all.
When you keep secrets, whether it be on a national level or an individual level, it's often for protection. And when I say protection, let's not say protection of the citizenry, because that's stupid, but for protection of the holder of that information.
Yes, I think that secrecy is tied to the protection of the holder of that information, right? But you what what we need to understand is that there's a danger in speculating about the motivations of certain political actions, right? Um, Motivations among the agents and the subjects, right, undertaking such political actions. Um, that being said, okay, let's just assume that, I don't know, the WikiLeaks documents or whatever leaks you want to talk about. Let's just assume that those are being kept secret for the sake of protection, right? Protection of the people who were keeping them secret. Now, if it strikes me as being difficult to suggest that that protection, the protection of those people, is not identical to the protection of the activity of the consolidation of power in effect, right?
Is the problem truly secret information, or is it the centralization of the information hierarchy at play in the United States?
Well, I think that the question of is secret information good or bad is a difficult question. I mean, on the one hand, it really depends on the content of secret information, but in order for me to make that value judgment, I have to have some knowledge of the content, in which case it wouldn't be secret, right? There's catch-22. I think historically, however, I can say that the consolidation of secrets by a government is not a terribly good sign, right? Um, just in general, maybe that's naive or something. But and the second point, you could criticize me as being ideological on, but I think that if this point is going to be ideological, it's probably an ideological commitment that you'd share with me, and that is that one thing that governments seem to do in their very nature is to consolidate their own power. Um, so it strikes me that it's very difficult to, on the one hand, affirm the necessity of the government, right, as such, and then on the other hand say, but I don't want it to consolidate power. Like, I'm not sure that you can do both of those things at the same time. Now, I don't have a way out of that deadlock, but what I would object to is any kind of moralism that says, this consolidation of power is wrong or something like that. Like, that strikes me as a kind of dead end.
And to me, the existence of secret information isn't a problem, as long as it's more than one authority or one group of authorities operating at the same level that have domain over it.
Well, all right. I get that, the whole checks and balances thing, right? But there's a problem for me about, you can say that there ought to be more than one authority, right, or more than one group of people who have access to said secret information or something like that. Distribution of secrecy across different agencies as being a good thing, right? You can make that claim. The problem with that, I think, is that for me, it doesn't come down to necessarily divisions within institutions, though that is an issue. I think that so long as you have sort of the same shared ideological commitments, that the management of those institutions are based on, if the soup that everybody swims in is the same soup, I guess you could put it that way, you're going to end up with the same problem. I don't think it's just about the organization of institutions. I think it's about the distribution of ideology as much as anything else. And that's a problem that I'm not sure how you could quite get across. Just a thought.
You bring up Weber's rational bureaucratic mechanisms, and that's where his interest of American culture at the time came into it, because American culture was doing something pretty new. We were hiring people for specific jobs.
Now you go on to talk about assembly lines and stuff. I'm just going to cut that for time, but yes, that what you say about Weber is true. The problem is that the question, I guess, is Weber's exposition of bureaucracy, right? Is really a critique of bureaucracy, right? It's not, and I mean, especially the people who came after him, the Frankfurt School, for instance, were using this analysis as a way to radically critique the United States power structure. You think of someone like Herbert Marcuse, or my beloved Adorno. So yes, you're right, but at the same time, you talk about it with certain accents on the beats that I wouldn't agree with. You know what I mean?
And we've applied this to government, we've applied this to education, we've applied this to everything, because this is the system that is the most efficient. Well, was the most efficient at that time. There are always situations in which bureaucracy fails because it's not adaptable enough, it's not changeable enough, or the authority within it is too centralized to allow for innovation and growth.
And there's a more classical concern there too, about the effect that bureaucracies have on the subject, right? I mean, I think that again, I mentioned people taking up Weber's exposition of bureaucratic power structures and recognizing that there's something kind of dehumanizing in it. And Max Weber talks about it himself. He talks about puts the human being in an iron cage, right? So that's a problem too, right? And that's a problem that I think needs be recognized, right? It might not be central to this video, but in talking about the issue of bureaucracy, that's something that's important, right? In other words, there's a value judgment of efficiency over like humanity, we could say, right? But that might be a bit Marxian or something.
Is that level to the extent where the US government should classify nothing? I think it would be very difficult for anyone to make that case. I don't think uploading the schematics for nuclear reactors to the internet would be a grand idea.
Yeah, I mean, but you think of examples like the Nuclear Boy Scout, who I just learned about recently. One of the best stories I've ever told. You can imagine a Coen Brothers movie about it or something. You think of the Nuclear Boy Scout, or even Michio Kaku building a particle accelerator in his basement when he was 18, right? That's not to say this information ought to be out in the world, but I think we're rapidly entering a situation wherein which it will be out in the world. And Kaku and the Nuclear Boy Scout were back in the 70s. Kaku maybe in the 80s. I'm not sure. You can date that for me. But as the internet advances, right, as every 13-year-old kid can get a hold of the Anarchist Cookbook, and such things, right? It seems like it seems very, very, very difficult to hold on to the idea that the best way of dealing with this issue is through the regulation of information by state power, because it seems quixotic, right? It seems doomed to fail. Now, how do you think about that in the absence of state secrecy management? I have no idea, but we'd better fucking get on it. I'll say that much.
This is the world that we're moving into. And it's a world that I don't think people truly understand. And I wouldn't say I truly understand it or the full implications of it either. Power is becoming democratized. Period. The ability for someone to control an individual is decreasing.
Now, within something like 35 minutes of the video that you presented, this point is very minimal, right? Just in time. But in my opinion, this is the point, right? This is what's interesting about it. This is what's essential about it. In my mind, what's interesting about Manning and Snowden is not so much the ethics of Manning and Snowden as individual agents or something like that, right? To condemn them condemn or praise them ethically for what they did. I mean, I think the fact of the matter is that what Manning and Snowden are, at least properly thought through, WikiLeaks as well, is they're exponents of a sort of dialectic between information technology and classical political power, right? The tension that those two things in my mind are in conflict with one another. I think it's a very difficult problem. Now, how do you manage that? How do you deal with that? Like, that's what the question of Manning and Snowden points to. I mean, in my mind, I don't care if Bradley Manning was a good guy or a bad guy, or he did something right or he did something wrong. I don't deify him as some kind of hero, nor do I condemn him as whatever. I mean, if it wasn't Manning, we would be talking about someone else. Like these kinds of leaks, these kinds of destabilizations, and the ability of governments to keep secret seems to me to be something that is becoming inevitable, and I can't imagine it diminishing anytime soon. And it's what I mean to say when I say that the position that you articulated is a bit provincial, is that given that's the case, isn't it a bit, isn't the question given a very tight focus, right? There seems to be a colossally bigger issue on the horizon, of which Manning and Snowden are examples, rather than Manning and Snowden are the people to be evaluated. And now I respect and I know that you're responding to particular people who are making particular arguments, and you're ensconced within a discourse and all of that. And don't get me wrong, that's not a problem. But it strikes me as being very difficult for me to make any kind of value judgment. In some way, I don't look at the people as people, right? Like I kind of just look at them as being output of this bizarre tension that we're living through between information technology and classical government power, right?
Processes to assist people in making these decisions so that we can minimize potential harms or alterations to that information. And in doing so, we've used the authority of the government in most cases to handle this for us.
Yeah, we have done that. It feels to me to be very difficult. There's a sort of a priori problem with saying I have information that will expose wrongdoings of the government, and so I'm going to go through government channels to do this, right? So I remember seeing, if you watch, there's a conversation between Slavoj Žižek and Julian Assange, and he said something that was interesting, which is, he says to Assange, you haven't just challenged power, you've challenged the way that people challenge power, right? And I don't want to say that, I don't want to make a value judgment, good or bad, on whether or not that's the case. But I think that's inevitable. Again, I don't think that the mechanisms in place for dealing with these kinds of things are sufficient to deal with them. I'm not sure that any mechanisms are sufficient to deal with them, to tell you the truth, any government mechanism.
And that's why there are laws like the Whistleblower Protection Act and things of that nature. We found that there wasn't a method in this living, adaptable system to bring this information to the public without potentially causing harm. And so we attempted to develop a method that would reduce harm based on a situation, the Ellsberg situation, in which we saw it was done without implementing great amounts of harm.
Now, okay, maybe it's the case that I'm just more skeptical of governments than you are, right? That might be the case. In which case that's going to be an ideological difference that's going to shape how we consolidate information, blah blah blah. But if you think about channels within the governmental apparatus, you say that it's about minimizing harm, and I think that's true, but I don't think it's just about minimizing harm in general. I think it's also designed to minimize harm to the government apparatus itself, right? So in some way, there's like you can imagine the distinction between registering a protest, right, and engaging in direct action, right? Those are two different categories. One that works within the system and one that doesn't. So at what point do you go from this works within the system and will therefore be designed to minimize harm to the system versus a more radical course of action which challenges not just the system but the way that we challenge the system, right? So if the consolidation of information agencies is an issue for you, do you think that that's an issue that can be dealt with through through channels that are built into those systems themselves, right? It strikes me as being more sure of a bet to step outside those channels and engage in some form of direct action than the alternative. But that again might be predicated on more suspicion on my part that might be greater than suspicion on your part. Who knows?
This is something that's been mentioned and somewhat known since 2007, that there were problems with the standard and that it was built into multiple products with this problem. And the suspicion has been that it was the NSA all along in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, when I heard about PRISM, my first reaction was, so? Didn't we already know this? Right? Like, maybe not to that extent, but I think there was a court... Please fact check me on this, right? But I believe there was a court case in 2009 where in the state of California, AT&T was subpoenaed for all the information that went through a given satellite between two different dates, right? I mean, when shit like that's going on, like, PRISM doesn't surprise me. Also, didn't Google have like a public partnership with the NSA before PRISM was announced? I mean, it strikes me as being obvious that, and all of this strikes me as being obvious. Now, the question about there's an ideological issue here, though, right? Like, is this a problem qua, the centralization of the NSA? You can say that, maybe, but it strikes me as being the case that it's actually a problem having to do with the centralization of the powers that be on the internet, right? It's a problem with corporate power and the centralization of corporate power, and how for some reason we're willing to volunteer. Here I am on YouTube doing just this, right? But for some reason we're willing to give all of our information to some centralized corporation, but not the government, right? There seems to me to be an ideological problem there, as though large centralized corporate power is somehow better, right, or somehow more benevolent, or they're looking out for us, or something like that. That I don't buy. I think that it should just be universally assumed that any information that you give to a large corporation, the government has, right? I think even if that's not necessarily true, I think that it would be better if people looked at things as if that were true. Put it that way.
Now, when we look at the information on the whole that's been released, there are some things I would say should have been released no matter what the methodology. One specific example of this would be from the, I believe it was in Cablegate, but it might have been a different batch of the documents that were produced to the public by WikiLeaks. The documents were largely unredacted in this particular set, and they spoke of how the U.S. has used basically economic power and has meddled with the government in countries like Haiti and kept their labor rates artificially low and have, in a way, economically oppressed the population of a whole country. To me, this is something that, regardless of how this information gets out, the consequence is so great. The number of people impacted is so large, and the number of potential future outcomes that are limited for what would largely be seen as, on a grander scale, personal gain, personal economic gain. That is something that is antithetical to my value system. Using dishonesty or the ability to control someone else in order to gain for yourself exclusively is the consequences of such an action are so dire that there is no wrong way to make people aware of this.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave this off with that clip, because I think that it probably clears up a lot for people who might be watching you and objecting to you. I think it's an interesting point, and I think it's a good place to leave it off. Not the least reason because I am fucking exhausted right now, and I've recorded a lot of video responding to these points, and I think my main criticisms are well represented here. Anything that I didn't touch on here, I probably agree with you about. The at one point at the end of your video, you say that they're the ones being provincial. All right, like, yeah, right. Sure, I'll buy that. Right. I think that the people who you're arguing with likely are being provincial. That doesn't necessarily mean that your case is not also provincial, right? And I hope that I've made a little bit clearer what I mean by that, and how I think that might be conceived of as problematic for your stance, and not necessarily problematic in any detrimental way, but problematic to the degree that perhaps there are things to think about, right? So thank you very much for responding. Thank you very much for the respectful tone of your response, and I hope you respond again. Have a good day.